How many of you, I think I mentioned earlier, how many of you read a book and find yourself, like I think I mentioned earlier, and I did talk this morning, and so I may be confused, find yourself reading along, and then paragraphs have gone by, sometimes pages have gone by. And then all of a sudden, you're waking up, and you've moved these pages. You know your fingers must have turned the page. But you don't know what's happened to you. How does that happen? How does that happen? There's nobody at the dashboard, and there isn't a dashboard. Right? I mean, that's a sign of our participation generally in our own experiencing. That could happen, that we could be flying along, interested, motivated, even juiced up with about what's going on, and that as we're proceeding, kind of just drift off and not even be aware that we fell out. Now I say that if a learner can't be aware at that edge when they fall out of and drop out, then I mean, what are we teaching them? Because there's no other place that they can act on themselves that's more fruitful than right there. And what is it that they've got to detect those edges? Well, that comes back to the capacities, the sensitivities. If they can't sense their own uncertainty and act on it, then they're going to constantly drop out and not even be aware that they crossed those points. That's what happened to me. That was part of what started this for me, was that I constantly found myself, despite being incredibly motivated, dropping out. And it wasn't because, I mean, yeah, I could have had a soundproof room and ate frequently and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't about that, and I was real clear it wasn't about that. It was about the fact that my attention span eroded because I let a lot of uncertainties and curiosities accumulate in my attention span that I didn't do anything about. So it was just kind of a lot of fuzz that starts to happen in your attention, and that just kind of just causes you to drop without being aware of it. It's not like it's some sharp thing. It's a whole bunch of little things that we're not paying attention because nobody's home at that level. And that's what's got to change. This is kind of a map of how that works a little. You can envision that at one level we got the flow of foreground, meaning the words, terms, phrases, pictures, sound bites, the piece parts. Even now as I talk, as I'm talking, as the words kind of float by, it's almost as if, remember I talked about the magnet filings and stuff inside? As if they're pulling stuff up in you to meet what I'm saying at the one level so as to make it make sense, to bring up the context, the background for which it makes sense. And that the first thing that we do is what I call relevancy ground, or build a bridge, that I say something and I listen to you and we kind of tune in to being somewhat close to the same place at the same time. If I'm a teacher and I really want to work interactively with one student, this is the first thing I do, is before I take you to that point where I'm going to stretch you into something new, we get together on the pier first, right? So let's assume this is that pier where we kind of meet before we go on to stretch into something new. And that this is the place where the stretch to something new occurs. And that this occurs, you know where this happens? This happens in attention span. Because that's what's being stretched, and that's what's got to span the learning process, right? Is that when I move from what's known to something that's entirely new, that movement occurs in attention. So every time, in this case, if you're the teacher and I'm listening and you're saying things, every time you use a word, term, or phrase, what you're doing is you're kind of building a staircase to allow me and my attention to move closer and closer to where you want to go. Now sometimes the words and terms and phrases and what you're saying is intending to be the stretch itself, and sometimes it's only intending to move me along. Is that clear? Now, when it's intended to move me along but I don't get it, it's a word that you've used that's incompatible with my vocabulary, or it's a bias or tone or emphasis, or you've used something that appeals to a cognitive bias or style that's not mine, or a sensory preference that doesn't work for me. In other words, it's more story than it is concrete, and I need the concrete, and all the stuff about learning styles and all the rest of it. Then what you do is, while in the act of facilitating my learning, you keep giving me steps that when I step on them, I fall through. And so my attention span drops and drops and drops and drops. Well, what this means when we translate it back is, that it's in this kind of window of attention span, in what I call the micro time of learning. Learning doesn't happen way out in time. It happens right now, microsecond by microsecond, in how every little part of what I say and do is received and processed in you. There is a reflective component, but the reflective component is fed by the now time component. And the reflective component, when it is happening, is also now. And it's that window in real time that when I have an uncertainty or a curiosity or an ambiguity or a desire to go into something, if I don't follow through with it, then I've suspended myself. And so I make a step, but I didn't go home there. I suspended myself. I make a step and I suspended myself. And that erodes attention span instead of facilitating learning. As in, one more example, let's get the lights back up. If you were to, today, when I read a book, if I'm reading a book, and I encounter a word that I don't understand, it's like the experience that I feel in my body is like driving a car that's out of tune. When you hit the gas pedal and the car kind of bogs. You know the feeling I'm talking about? When you go to accelerate and the car just goes on you? I vivify my uncertainty so that it feels that way to my body. So when I encounter something like that, I actually feel the drops. And feeling the drops, I have some basis from which to act. Because if I don't feel the drops, then I just kind of go along and I drop out because I wasn't aware that I was falling out. Right? So what we're saying then is that if we're going to develop environments, let me cycle this back, if we're going to develop environments that can bring forth these qualities of participation in a learner into their own capacities, as we've been describing, then it requires that the learning environments that these learners are developing in are responsive to them at their level of what I call meaning needs. These things that we've been talking about here, I want to say that they're meaning needs. In other words, this flow is coming by, and it invoke in me a need more. I need more here, or I'm going to drop. I'm starting to fall. I need more. If every time learners have need mores, they can act on them, then they learn how to tune and instrument and create this dashboard we were talking about. If, on the other hand, when they have these need mores, there's nothing to do with them, then what they learn, and this is what education is teaching us now, is those need mores don't mean anything. And that's got the effect of chopping off the capacity for learning right at its source. So what we're saying then is we need to develop environments in the way that little groups work, in the way that teachers relate to individual students, in the way that a classroom functions as a whole, in the way that information and technology relates to learners, and in the way the whole system relates to a school, through a district, through a state, through a government, through a world, as if bringing forth this kind of responsivity in the learner was most important. It is most important. Look at what we went through in business, or individual well-being, or psychological health, or physical health, or in our own observations of ourselves. So how is it that we build these environments? What do they look like? After the break, I'll show you one of them in a piece of technology. Let's have a break.